Do we live in a simulation like the Matrix? And is believing that we live in the Matrix a skeptical position? Stick around to learn more. Hello, my name is Father Ambrose Little, and I teach philosophy at the Dominican House of Studies. Welcome to Aquinas 101, Big Questions, Little Answers, the series where I do my best to answer your big questions about philosophy, theology, and more. Today I'm going to be taking my first question submitted through our free Aquinas 101 digital learning platform. If you haven't heard about it yet, please check it out. It is a great way to have a personalized experience of Aquinas 101. There we have organized our videos into courses which track your progress, quizzes that help you to remember what you learned, and an easy way to submit questions to me. It will soon become my preferred method for receiving questions, so check it out at aquinas101.thomisticinstitute.org. Turning to our question, one viewer says, "In my philosophy class at university, the professor is quite the skeptic. He holds the claim that we are in the Matrix, that this world is an illusion, and that our senses cannot be trusted. I know this is not true because our lives would be meaningless if it were. How does Thomas Aquinas refute this? I would love to have his knowledge on my side to refute this ideology." This is an interesting question, and there are aspects of it that make it very difficult to answer directly. The first difficulty is that while St. Thomas did address certain versions of skepticism, he did not live in an environment where this was a live question. So while St. Thomas has tools he can use to answer it, such an answer is long and complicated and more appropriate for a class. However, I will do what I can to give a brief and incomplete response here. The second difficulty is that the position as described is not really a skeptical position, although it is frequently associated with a radical version of skepticism. Why do I say this? Well, let's briefly consider some classical examples of skepticism in philosophy. First, let's look at the ancient skeptic philosopher Sextus Empiricus, who belonged to a school of skepticism called Pyrrhonism. In this version of skepticism, the philosopher accepts the following fundamental principle. To every argument, an equal argument is opposed. The idea here is that for any argument for a given position, an equally plausible argument against it can also be given. Sextus tells us that, quote, "Skepticism is an ability to place in antithesis, in any manner whatever, the appearances and judgments, and thus, because of the equality of force in the objects and arguments opposed, to come first of all to a suspension of judgment, and then to mental tranquility." End quote. There is a lot we can say about this, but the principal point I want to make is that for Sextus, the skeptic aims to convince us to suspend judgment about whether something is true or not. In other words, the skeptic does not want to say whether or not something is true or false. The theory presented by the questioner, that we live in the Matrix, is actually affirming two things. First, that our senses are unreliable, which is a typical skeptical position, and second, that we live in a simulation. No true skeptic would affirm the second proposition. Instead, he would say simply, we can't know if the world is a simulation or not, and leave it at that. That's one kind of skepticism. Another famous version of skepticism is the method of skepticism presented by René Descartes. In his Meditations, Descartes famously leads the reader through a meditative process of doubt, with the goal of finding something which is undoubtable. In the process, he first doubts our senses, then he doubts whether he is even awake, and lastly he raises the possibility that we might live in an illusion constructed by an evil demon. The point of these doubts is not to assert that any doubt is true, but rather to find something that we can no longer doubt. Again, what makes Descartes' method skeptical is not that it proposes and defends the idea that we live in an illusion, but that the bare possibility of conceiving of such a demonic illusion should make us doubt it and thus turn elsewhere for certitude. However, that doubt is very different than the claim that we live in a simulation. I should note that there are reductio ad absurdum responses a Thomist can give to real skepticism, but I will not do that here. For our purposes, what these examples of skepticism show us is that the skeptic is defined by being non-committal. That is, the skeptic is unsure what is true and what is false. But the proponent of the view that we live in a simulation makes a pretty bold metaphysical claim about the world. Therefore, the view that the world is a simulation is not a skeptical position. It is a metaphysical position that affirms that our senses are unreliable and that we live in a simulation. How would St. Thomas respond to this position? One response is what the 20th century philosopher David Lewis referred to as the incredulous stare. It looks something like this. Lewis himself often received such a stare and admitted that he did not know how to refute it. Another version of the same argument was used by Samuel Johnson against George Berkeley, who held that the material world does not exist and that the universe is merely ideal, not unlike the simulation view. Upon hearing this, Dr. Johnson is said to have kicked a stone and said, "I refute it thus." While these responses are partially jokes, they do highlight something important to recognize. Sometimes people have fundamental disagreements about fundamental principles. When that happens, sometimes the incredulous stare is the best response, because making an argument is in fact counterproductive. St. Thomas says something like this in his commentary on Aristotle's Physics, where Aristotle himself notes that one ought not to argue for some fundamental principles, like the idea that nature exists. St. Thomas writes, quote, "To wish to demonstrate the obvious by what is not obvious is the mark of a man who cannot judge what is known in itself and what is not known in itself. For when he wishes to demonstrate that which is known in itself, he uses that which is known in itself as if it were not known in itself. And it is clear that some people do this." End quote. There is a lot that could be said here, but the point is, if you don't start your arguments with things that are obvious, you can never prove anything with clarity. One of those obvious starting points for St. Thomas just is that our senses are reliable, even if they may, on occasion, be slightly off. That being said, there are more complicated ways that a Thomist, and even non-Thomists, could show that the view that the world is a simulation is self-defeating, but I will leave that for the journals. For now, just know that the incredulous stare is perfectly acceptable in some rare circumstances, and I think this is one of them. That's all I have for you today. Thanks for joining me for this episode of Big Questions, Little Answers. I look forward to seeing you next time. Until then, may God bless you and keep you in His grace. I hope that answers all your questions, but if not, please let us know by submitting your big questions using our free digital learning platform, or by using hashtag AskAFriar in the YouTube comments and on social media. And don't forget to subscribe, like, and share with your friends, because it matters what you think.